I'm down at my sister's place in Temagog on Dungutty country, where the Willy Willy Road fires have been burning for about a week. They're still active on the edges of the 23,000 hectare perimeter. I'd like to give you some information and tips on how to look after wildlife post-fire, including safety, injured animals, water, food and habitat, and also how you can help if you're not in the vicinity. I just drove up, my sister lives on 200 acres, I've just driven up to take this footage, and I passed a kangaroo very, very slowly because his pads were burnt and he actually can't move that well. It's really devastating. After a bushfire's been through, there's a lot of emotion and there's a lot of heightened adrenaline, and it's really natural for many of us just to want to help and get in there and try and fix and save, but unfortunately sometimes that can do a lot more damage than it can do good. So the first thing that we all need to consider after a natural disaster is safety. In terms of your own safety, don't ever enter an active fire ground unless you have the permission or the training to do so. Even after a fire's been through, like here, it's probably 5 days since the fire went through, there's still trees burning, falling over, and there's hot spots as well. So it's paramount to consider what you're doing and how you're approaching it, and to make sure that you're safe at all times. In terms of wildlife and their safety, most of them are hugely distressed, and also if they're injured, they're going to be in a heightened state. So don't ever approach wildlife to try and help them if you're not trained and you don't know how to do that. There's plenty of people in the New South Wales Parks and Wildlife Service, as well as a number of wildlife organisations that are trained to go onto fireground and help wildlife. So contact them and ask them to do what you want to do yourself. I4 has a great app that you can download on your phone, and it will list the wildlife services that are closest to the locality where you live. On the Mid-North Coast it's Fauna, and they will offer help. Their phones are available 24 hours around the clock. Also, if you're living on a rural property, you have to consider your livestock and your domestic pets in terms of putting out food, water and making habitats for wildlife, but I'll talk about that a bit later on. Access to clean, fresh water is so imperative for wildlife, particularly in the days after a natural disaster. I've got a couple of examples here which I'll run you through. I think things to think about is access, because you need to regularly change the water to make sure that it's always fresh and clean. And also, as I'll show you, make sure that where the water source is, small animals aren't going to get stranded in the water. For example, this one's probably the most easiest. Just a saucer. This one's quite large. You just fill it up with water. Make sure that you have a stone or a stick based in it so that any small creatures that get lodged in the water can find their way out again. Super cheap, super easy. You can put as many of these around as you want to. Another example is, I don't have the actual rig here, but it's called a tree trough, and they use containers similar to this one, and then a kind of a steel structure with pipes coming out of it that are erected up in trees. And these are for arboreal animals like koalas or gliders. My brother said that since the 2019 fires, there haven't been any signs of koalas here. We definitely do have gliders and possums, but we're not going to erect these ones because changing the water regularly is really important, and the access to these is a little bit difficult for my sister. So instead we've made about 5 of these which we've put around the property. I've made a video on how to make these, super easy. So follow the link to that video with step-by-step instructions. And I know that Wise have just restarted their Water for Wildlife program, and they have about 800 of these systems available for free if you make an application through their website. during the 2019 fires, there was also a program, Water for Wildlife, that constructed these water stations. Super, super simple. I'm just going to check because the water actually has gone down low here. So I'm going to see whether or not it's all been drunk. I put this in place probably about 2 days ago. Yep, all empty. That's a really good sign. There are a couple of big dams on this property, but things to think about in terms of water is we've got rain predicted, fingers crossed, in about 2 days, which is great for so many reasons. It'll bring a flush through of grass. But my sister pointed out that after the 2019 fires, they had a rainfall and all of the ash and the black ran into those dams and actually made the water quite undrinkable for animals. So you can't put enough water stations around your yard or your property for animals. Water is essential. It's the number one thing. If you don't do anything else, put some water stations around. So many creatures use these water stations. Insects, reptiles, maybe birds, mammals. So easy to make. Check out the video and put as many of these around as you're able to service and keep topped up. If all you do is provide a water source for wildlife, then that is a lot. They really need access to fresh, clean water, particularly after natural disasters. The landscape that's left behind after a bushfire is really confronting, and it often brings the impulse to want to put food out for animals because clearly there's no food around. And it's really important to know that food for wildlife is really tricky and can sometimes do a lot more harm or even kill the animal than it does help them. The Taronga Conservation Society has put out a sustainable food guide. It's really comprehensive and really easy to read, and that lists all the different appropriate foods for different species, as well as tips and foods that can harm them. Things to consider when you are putting out food. Well, from my experience here is I've put out a few different food stations over the last week. Some of them haven't even been touched, and I got in contact with a wildlife vet nurse to ask her about that to see if I was doing something wrong or is there something better that I could do. And she let me know that often the food that we put out is really foreign to wildlife. It's not really something they've come across before. So sometimes they won't take to it, and sometimes it'll take them a while to take to it. So the things to consider are not putting out too much food, because overfeeding the animals can create a dependency or it can harm them. And really we only want to give them food in critical situations when there's nothing around. We want them to be able to get back to their normal food stocks when that comes through. I mean, I'm looking over there, there's tiny little green shoots on some of the areas coming through, so hopefully it won't be too long until there's some types of food sources for some animals. The other thing is to think about, there's going to be animals that are weaker than others due to injuries. So make sure the food that you put out is dispersed so that there isn't a congregation of dominant animals over weaker ones, and that different animals can get the foods that they are trying to access. One of the things to consider, depends where you live, is it's been suggested not to put food back in the same spot regularly for wildlife because of predators. I did read a report that came out after the fires down in Victoria. They have something like 3 times the national average of wild cats. And so that was a real issue, cats and foxes predating on wildlife that had survived the bushfires. So yeah, I don't know, you're just going to have to work that one out and use your common sense. I'm putting it here. Typically I would have not put it near a water source because that's kind of, you know, an obvious place where predators might go to. But given that on this property, which is 200 acres, I have seen scarce animals. I mean, I just saw a crane take off, which was really lovely. It's in one of those trees up there. I just want to try and do what I think will work in the first instance and put it where I know I've seen animals. I was just thinking maybe, you know, another tip to work out where to put the food. I mean, I'm devastated here. I spoke to Fauna 2 days ago, and they were saying that a man up the road from here had a possum and babies and a bandicoot and a rat all on his veranda, kind of shivering after the fire. And I mean, I was like, wow, and a lace monitor. And I was like, that's great that he's got all of those, because I've just seen a couple of wallabies. I did hear a bandicoot last night, which was good. But anyway, I was thinking one of the things that you could do is have a look if you can see any tracks, fresh tracks. I saw some fresh tracks over just there before, earlier this morning. Or you can have a look if you can see fresh scats. So if you kind of get a sense of where you've seen animals moving through, of course you can see their tracks where their typical paths are, if they still use them, then that might be a good way of also trying to work out where to put food down. We have to think about livestock and horses. So they've also been through a really distressful situation when the fire came through here, and are quite out of sorts and have sensitive stomachs. So I don't want them to eat the food that I'm putting out for the wildlife in case it harms the horses, but I also don't want them to eat the food because I want it to be there for wildlife. I'm going to make some bird feeding stations, and there'll be a separate video to show you how to easily rig up some of those. I guess really the main thing is to just use your common sense, follow the sustainable food guide, don't overfeed the animals, be really aware of all the different species and where they usually access food. Is it up in trees? Is it on the ground? Try not to put the food that you're putting out on burnt ground so that they're not eating the ash if there are any spaces that aren't burnt. And if you're in doubt, contact your local wildlife care service and they'll be able to head you in the right direction. I want to talk about habitat for wildlife post-fire, which I'm personally feeling very overwhelmed about right at this time being here, because there really isn't much habitat at all for a whole range of creatures. Reptiles, birds are kind of okay. There's still some canopy around. Last night I did hear a glider. In the background over here, you can see a nest box on that apple gum. After the 2019 fires, my sister worked with Landcare, and they put up, it must be a dozen nest boxes through this property. And one of the things with habitat that I've been thinking about with my family, it's not just habitat for active wildlife that survived the fires, it's also animals that didn't survive the fires. So we are going to do a collection of all of the dead animals that are on this property, and there's quite a lot, and dispose of them well, so that one, it doesn't create an attraction for predators, two, it looks after the waterways, and I guess also it's going to help the other surviving wildlife. Part of that too is, if we're able to, because the ladder burnt in the fire, is to check the nest boxes that are still around. I have a feeling there's going to be some dead creatures in those. They may have tried to seek shelter in them and either died from smoke inhalation or heat. So they're essential at the moment, the nest boxes, because well, the 2019 fires pretty much took out a lot of habitat, and we're going to have to really try and help create new habitat at this point. I've found 2 examples of habitat that have been artificial habitats that have been created after fires. One was this cool looking kind of teepee shaped cardboard with holes in it. That's good for small animals to get in and out of. And also it's been used more extensively, it's kind of chicken wire tunnels with shade cloth on it. I probably won't be able to put too much of that around in the open paddocks because of the horses. I have to think about the horses either hurting themselves or disturbing animals. They will be curious and they'll want to know what it is. Habitat's probably, well, artificial habitat's probably the least I know about or have researched, because I'm just an advocate for proper habitat for animals and wildlife. So I'm making a decision to put these in places, one where I know there's no overhanging branches that could possibly fall that are burnt. Not too close to water sources, but close enough for refuge. I won't put it near a food source. And partly I'm going to put some places where there's no other shelter, and other places I'll put it where there's a little clump of trees. So I'm just going to mix it up a little bit. I don't know whether this design is appropriate, but I've thought about it quite a bit and I don't think it can do any harm. So that's really what I'm basing this design on. It's a super simple structure. I kind of modified the one that I saw online, that TP designed one. It's basically a cardboard box. It's got an end cut in each end so that if something's in there it can get out the other side if a predator comes along. I don't know, maybe bandicoots, or not, they tend to live under the ground a bit, birds, even reptiles. Maybe just a little bit of refuge, a little bit of shade, just a little place to have a rest if needed. A big shout out and a massive thanks to all the wildlife carers who volunteer their time to help injured wildlife, particularly after natural disasters. It's a highly confronting situation, and full respect to people that do it. I myself have been here for a week. I think we're up to 29,000 hectares that's been burnt. A lot of that is state forest and bush. And you have these moments where you see injured wallabies that can't move very far, but they're mobile enough that you can't catch them. And then you see moments where kangaroos are drinking from the dam and you just feel this huge sense of relief. I'm starting to notice a return of a few different birds. I don't live down here, so it's a very different soundscape and ecology to what I'm used to. So for people that live far away when there's a natural disaster, my best recommendation is to either use that i4 app to see the local wildlife organisation in the area where the natural disaster has been and donate your money. Fauna, for example, when I spoke to them last week, I'm probably going to get the stats wrong, but I think in the 2019 fires they donated and distributed something like 16 tonnes of bird seed, and it was almost the equivalent in macropod food as well. So it's a huge expense and it's all donated by people like you and me. So you can either put water stations out, make bird feeders, create habitats, or you can just donate money if you don't live nearby, because that's what's needed to help. The wildlife situation in Australia pretty much is fueled by a whole lot of volunteer and personal donations. So a massive thanks to all the wildlife organisations who put their time and energy into helping our precious, precious animals. The massive amount of habitat that's been lost here is devastating, and it was only just coming back 4 years after the 2019 wildfires that decimated this area. So we all need to join together, work together, and support each other in supporting our wildlife and this land. Hope that you found some of these tips helpful, and thanks so much if you have contributed to the help of wildlife.